Yair Givati is a partner with Jerusalem legal firm Haim Givati Co. He's a specialist in property transactions, property management, as well as corporate and commercial transactions here in Israel. And that makes him perfect for this discussion about property from the angle of taxation, if you like, purchasing property. And we're talking to anybody, but specifically talking to Olim. Yair, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I just want to start with the assumption that buying property in Israel is possibly not quite like buying property in America, Britain, Australia, or wherever.
No, it's actually quite different. From Australia, there's a whole different aspect of how they do things when it comes to private homes. But especially if you're talking about America, there are things that are completely different, or sometimes completely the other way around when it comes to the transactions. If we touch, for just a few examples, like in the US, for example, the most important date when it comes to a real estate transaction is the date of closing. It's a date where you make the last payment and you take possession. In Israel, it's quite the opposite. In Israel, the defining date is the day you sign the purchase agreement. Even if you're buying it from a new build, when you're going to get the apartment in 3, 4, 6 years, the defining date is the date that you sign the purchase agreement. So everything derives from that. Us as lawyers had to report the transaction to the tax office within 30 days. The purchase tax had to be paid within 60 days. Payments are calculated from the day you sign the contract. The date that you sign the contract means the day you purchase the agreement, even if you don't have possession. So there are major differences. I don't think there's even a point of trying to compare. So because I think the best recommendation I have to people buying from the US is actually to lose your expectation. Things work here differently. Don't try to compare. Make sure you have the right people to guide you through the process.
So you're at the beginning of the process. You've seen a property, which this year, what we've seen as well is people actually don't even see the property. They're not flying here to walk around it. They're walked around it on Zoom, and they've decided they want to purchase a property. Should we differentiate at this point between new build and an existing property, or is it essentially the same?
Yeah, I want to touch small item about that, which is actually funny these days. We've seen, because of Corona and everything happening around the world, there's a lot of interest of people buying from abroad here in Israel. Now, what many of us have seen is that actually a lot of people are buying in new builds and new construction, because at the end of the day, if you're living in America or Israel, if you are buying off the plans, it makes no difference. You're in the same level. Sometimes if you want to buy a second-hand home, so somebody who lives in Israel can actually come and visit the property and see it, might have an edge. But when you buy off the plans and the building hasn't been started building, then it's much easier for someone from abroad to relate to it, because the Israelis don't have any edge over them. So we've seen a lot of it actually happening during this time when people see plans. But we've also seen interest of people buying second-hand home with Zoom or with other ways of seeing the property and the location. And with the technology nowadays, people can even see the view from the future apartment, whether it's built or not. So it's funny that during this time, but we've seen quite a number of people that deal a lot with Anglos see quite a raise, or a lot of people are buying nowadays in Israel, even from afar.
So that's actually very interesting. I can consider that. It's actually very interesting. So you've seen a property, whether it's on paper or an existing property, and you've made a decision. You I want to put a deposit down. What should be your next step? I mean, I presume this is where things start to get different.
Okay, yeah, but I would say that first of all, you need to plan ahead of time, and this is part of what we said we're going to discuss today, is the question of taxation.
Right.
The question of taxation is huge, because other than the purchase price, the purchase tax is the highest amount you'll pay for anything relating to the purchase. So planning ahead of time makes a huge difference with relating to the purchase tax you're going to pay. And I'll give a few examples. If you're, for example, interested in buying over the green line, Then it can be in places like Givat Ze'ev, in Ma'ale Adumim, in the Gush area, for example, if you're talking the Jerusalem area. These are places over the Green Line. Now, if you buy a property over the Green Line and you're neither an Israeli resident or a citizen, then there is no purchase tax to pay. But you have to purchase it at least 2 years before you move to Israel. So this is really very important to do it ahead of time, because we talk, it could be tens and hundreds of thousands of shekels difference between buying it 2 years or a year and 10 months before. It makes a huge difference. But let's touch, more points. There's a few ways you need to calculate the purchase tax. And if we touch on the base, the general purchase tax rate is what people from abroad would buy, or in Israeli buying their second or any additional apartments more than the first one. And this starts with 5, 6, and 7%, and on the higher end can even go up to 8 and 10%. That's a general tax rate. Now, if you're an Israeli resident buying your single residency, which in brackets I'll say that also if you have one and you're buying a new one and selling the first one, it still could be considered your first apartment or your single residency. Then you have a leniency of a lower tax rate, which starts from 0, 3.5%, 5%. Again, on the higher end, it can still reach 8 and 10%. But in order to use that leniency, if you're buying from abroad, you have to make sure that you have moved to Israel within 2 years of signing the contract. Again, we're going back to what we said before. The defining date is the date you sign the contract. And you count 2 years from that point. If you have made Aliyah or moved to Israel, became a resident within 2 years, then you will be able to get the purchase tax back. And we're talking about a significant amount of money. If you go from 0 to 5, 6, or 7%. Right. But if you do it 2 years in a week, you will not be able to do that. So the planning is very important. And also, if we touch another leniency possibility for someone making Aliyah is the Aliyah right. Now, the Aliyah right starts from 0.5% and goes up to 5%, and that it's capped at 5%. So what are the differences? The differences is if you make Aliyah and you already own an apartment in Israel, then you can still use your Aliyah rights, which you'll pay less tax than the general tax of 5, 6, and 7%.
Right.
But if you're buying your single residency, then depends on the purchase price. Up to about 5 or 5.5 million shekels, it's more beneficial for the person buying to use your single residency purchase tax, because you'll end up paying less tax because it starts from 0%. While Aliyah rights, it starts at 0.5%. So definitely on the lower end and up to about 5 or 5.5 million shekels, it's better to use your single residency. If you're buying a higher end apartment, then you want to use your Aliyah rights because you end up paying less tax. So planning ahead of time and knowing when you're buying it can make a significant difference. But how does it relate to the Aliyah? The Aliyah rights, if you remember what we spoke before about the residency, which you have to make Aliyah within 2 years. Mm-hmm. If you're making Aliyah, you have to be within 1 year from the purchase, from signing the purchase agreement. And you can use that right up to 7 years. There's another little caveat that not many people know, that if you're buying from a builder, you have the right to move to Israel within 3 years, or whenever the letter of occupancy was received for the building, whichever one comes first. So if you're an Oleh Hadash, which you want to use your Aliyah rights, which as we discussed, we see which is more beneficial. But if you do decide you want to use your Aliyah rights, then buying from a builder, you have longer time than you're buying from a second-hand home.
That's interesting.
But that's part of why you take a lawyer. A lot of people, I'm not going to tell you that it's rare, but some people buy from a builder, without taking a lawyer. I think, it's foolish in a way, because at the end of the day, we're your insurance. If you don't take a lawyer, you wouldn't necessarily know all the ins and outs. And when you have to take your lawyer, you have to make sure that you take someone you can trust and make sure he guides you and guarantee all your rights.
That's a very good point for me to say that what we're going to do is we're going to place underneath your contact information if anybody's got any questions, because we have really scratched the surface of what I know is an extremely complex
Yes. People can feel free to email me with any question they might have. It'd be my pleasure to help and answer any question you might have.
Brilliant. I can't thank you enough. Yeah, it's been really interesting. And again, we have scratched the surface of a very deep pool of information that people need to know. And we're talking about large amounts of money. Buying the property is the single biggest purchase that almost anybody ever makes. And you want to get this right. And buying from a strange country, even more so.
Strange language, strange people. Yeah, it's you need to make sure you're well protected. And like you said, there's so many things that are relating to real estate. Whether you move to Israel first, try it, or you want to rent, or everything has to do with real estate. You have to make sure somebody takes care of you, especially if you just come here, or you're doing it from abroad. There's so many aspects of things. There's so many changes in the law. If we just talk, shortly, changes that have been in the law in the last few years. People are buying now, or who have bought 6 months ago, the taxation changed. So people buying now actually would pay less tax. If you talk about rental law, the rental law was changed in 2017, which was not that long ago. So, you have to make sure that people are not taking advantage of you because you don't know the law. And, you have to make sure somebody helps you and guides you on your first steps here in Israel. Find
yourself a good lawyer. Yeah, his information will be below. Thank you so much. Thank you. I know you're busy, and you had calls coming in as we were starting this, so I really appreciate the time.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to Yair Givati. I'll put a link to his firm's website on the info with this podcast. And that's it for this week's edition. I really hope you enjoyed it and that the sound of my children in the background didn't disturb too much. Life in lockdown. If you did enjoy this, then please hit the subscribe button, and of course a like, a share, or even a comment would be incredibly welcome too. Now, if you need to buy or sell shekels, then please visit www.IsraTransfer.com. That's where you can organize your money transfer to and from Israel via the IsraTransfer homepage. You can also get in touch with IsraTransfer, or the team I should say, from there, as well as via the Facebook page. And you can access a mine of information about Israel's financial system, buying property and investment in Israel in the IsraTransfer blog. I'll be back at the start of next week with another episode, and until then, shalom v'lehitraot from Israel.